If I asked you to imagine a generic philosopher, you would probably conjure up the image of some dude waxing poetic about ethics and morals in hypotheticals. Now, modern philosophy does have this kind of reputation, but ancient philosophy, that's a whole different ballgame. Ancient philosophers certainly did debate morals and ethics the way modern philosophers do, but they were probably best known for their work in science. See, before scientists were really a thing, philosophers were the ones who attempted to explain and understand the world around us. They would rationalize their way to understanding. They were scientists who could only present hypotheses, and they were, very often, very, very wrong, at least by today's standards. Now, this may surprise you, but Hoyoverse is a huge fan of ancient philosophy, especially when it comes to Plato. Never has this been more explicit than in the 3.8 Bottleland event, because that baby is stuffed with ancient philosophy, and I am going to use all of it to explain and contextualize all this Irminsul memory wipe time rewrite nonsense. Now, I am obligated to tell you that this is the finale of my 4-part series that has been split into 2 parts, making this officially a 5-part series, but that's only because there's a lot of heavy information to digest and I didn't want to confuse anybody. It totally had nothing to do with me not wanting to edit another 45-minute video. Nope, totally didn't. So with that out of the way, allow me to officially introduce part 1 of the finale to this 4-part series. This is the video where all these seemingly disjointed ideas start coming together into one cohesive package. This is the theory of Project Teyvat. So I mentioned that the 3.8 Bottleland event was stuffed full of Greek philosophy, but really what it was is a very explicit use of Plato's allegory of the cave, but in a bottle with anime characters. In the allegory of the cave, Plato describes a hypothetical group of people who have been imprisoned in a cave since childhood. They've been bound and chained so they can only gaze at the wall in front of them, upon which is cast a shadow puppet show put on by a group of puppeteers. The prisoners have no idea these puppeteers exist because they've never seen them, and they believe that the images cast on the wall to be their true reality. But then one of the prisoners breaks free of their chains, then turns around and sees the puppets, the puppeteers, and the light that they use to cast the shadows on the wall. This sight is so foreign and confusing, and the light is so bright that the prisoner willingly turns back to the wall. In other words, they reject the truth because it's too difficult to process. But what if that prisoner was forced out of the cave? They would have been assaulted with the incredibly bright light of the sun that was casting objects in 3 full dimensions instead of gazing upon the 2D flatness of the cave wall. They would have no choice but to acknowledge that this was the true reality. Now imagine this freed prisoner went back into the cave in order to tell the other prisoners about what they saw. Their eyes would have adjusted to the light, so the darkness of the cave would have blinded them. The other prisoners would therefore believe that the freed prisoner's experience had caused them some sort of irreparable harm and would never willingly take part in their offer to leave the cave, thereby willingly imprisoning themselves in the cave instead. Now, this allegory is connected to another one that we're going to talk about later, and it's meant to talk about how the soul is imprisoned in the body the way that these prisoners were kept in a cave. However, in Genshin, we take things literally. Bottleland really pushes the shadow puppet theme, as Edea has willingly imprisoned herself within a bottle and uses these special projectors to cast images on the walls that she calls preprints. In Bottleland, everything starts as a preprint and only takes shape after being illuminated by a streaming projector. The biggest streaming projector, which takes the shape of a spinning wheel, is the one in the center of Bottleland, but in order for it to function properly, it needs all of its components. These components aren't like machine parts, though, as they manifest as seemingly random objects. In this case, they are a gear, a rope, a candy box, and a lamp. As it turns out, these objects were gifts to Edea from the visitors to Bottleland, and she uses them to alter her realm using the streaming projector after powering it up with the wishes and dream energy from the Shinro casket. You can kind of think of these objects as like objects used to cast shadows on the wall of the cave. So to summarize, within the Bottleland domain, everything starts as shadows on the wall called preprints, which can manifest in the real world with the help of a streaming projector, which is powered by memories and wishes, and also formed physically via elemental energy. If the first thing you thought of when I called this streaming projector that shapes reality with wishes was the loom of fate, then you probably have a pretty good idea of where I'm going with this theory. Because right now, the big reality-shaping thing into that has a connection to fate is Irminsul. You remember our good old buddy Irminsul here, right? It's a massive amalgamation of memories and energy which it continuously collects via its ley line root system. Yeah, that Irminsul. Well, this constant influx of information that it has allows it to function like a giant repository. And at first blush, that seems to be all Irminsul is, a giant historical record woven into the fabric of reality itself. But if it were just a repository, it wouldn't be able to physically alter the world, and Irminsul does that a lot. By tampering with it, you could erase yourself from history, or you could change the ecosystem of an entire mountain to be an Arctic wasteland, or you could lock an entire island in a ghostly time loop, or you could get yourself trapped in an underground cave that has no beginning and no end with rooms that give your innermost fears physical forms and... Well, I think it's pretty clear that fundamentally this tree seems to form reality in some way, not just record it. And that makes it pretty similar to the streaming projector. Now, the inner workings of Irminsul are still a bit of a mystery. However, it is reasonable to assume that since Rukkhadevata was literally the avatar of Irminsul, that her creations would mimic aspects of this tree, specifically with regards to the Akasha. The Akasha was originally created in order to find a way to eliminate forbidden knowledge, and to do this, it needed a source of intelligence and information. Thus, Rukkhadevata gave it the ability to harvest the dreams of the Sumerian people, since she believed that wisdom lied in dreams. The Akasha would then take the people's dreams and compile it into wisdom. This is quite similar to how Irminsul uses ley lines to siphon memories for storage. Now, I know that dreams and memories don't seem to be related in any meaningful way here, but for the purposes of this theory, let's just put them both under the blanket umbrella of thoughts, okay? Dreams being unconscious thoughts and memory being conscious thoughts. This will make more sense later on, I promise. Now, the Akasha, at least, is capable of more than storage. We know for a fact that it can twist one's perception of reality. Case in point is this scene here where Azar doesn't actually know if Nahida is there or not. We also know that it can be used to create a non-physical reality, a dream world. In Nahida's first story quest, a man named Moseus uploaded his consciousness into the Akasha and constructed a very elaborate dream world within it, using the Akasha's power as well as the jnana energy, or rather, dream energy, that he harvested from individuals within the city who could also enter the dream world whenever they slept. We can see something kind of similar in the way that Apep functions. Apep's sentient fragments talked quite a bit about this dream world that they lived in that existed within the Dendro Dragon. They were a part of her, but they were still individuals. Apep was the dominant mind of this collective unconscious, if you will, just like how Moseus was the dominant mind of the dream world. A very similar theme can be found in Alhaitham's first story quest, wherein we confronted a literal hive mind. And you could argue that the Simurgh in the desert was a very similar entity to Apep, since it shattered into the smaller Pari. The Oceanids are also confirmed to be some sort of hive mind or collective consciousness, since they freely merge with one another and also possess a dominant mind. And of course, we can't forget King Deshret's golden slumber, wherein a million minds merged into one as they entered a golden dream. So you can see there's this undeniable theme of many minds becoming one mind, and one mind becoming many minds, often using dreams. There are so many dream themes. The Akasha uses dreams, and it's powered by dream energy. The fragments of Apep are part of the dream of the Dendro Dragon. The Aranara live within a dream space. Deshret built the Golden Slumber, and it's only during slumber that one dreams, and you enter the Golden Dream in his whole little thing. And then the Goddess of Flowers was also known as the Mistress of Dreams. We've got Leonard's dream that was forced upon people via his constellation during the Unreconciled Stars event. And then we have Dainsleif talking about those who dream of dreaming in the Travail trailer. So the real question then becomes, why collective consciousnesses and why dreams? The collective unconscious was a term coined by Carl Jung, and it was a theory that ran in contrast to the Western philosophy of the personal unconscious, which was developed by Sigmund Freud. Ironically, these two worked together studying the unconscious mind, but ended up on two very different sides of the argument. Now, Freud believed that the human mind was impermeable, that the mind was only shaped by the experiences of the individual. But Jung proposed the idea that the human mind bled into the surrounding world and contributed to a greater collective of all minds. This greater collective would be shared and therefore inherited by every other mind, hence the collective unconscious. He used this theory to explain why so many people can manifest the same fears and phobias for no apparent reason, and why so many people share similar morals and ethics despite never meeting, and why there were so many shared myths and Genesis stories and, that kind of thing. That's really as in-depth as I'm going to go for this video, but if you want to learn a little bit more about why Jungian psychology manifests itself in Eastern pop culture and media, Daryl Talks Games made a really great video on this topic that I highly recommend. I will leave a link for you down below. But with Jungian psychology in mind, it's pretty easy to see the Akasha, the Golden Slumber, Apep, and Irminsul as different manifestations of this theme of collective unconsciousness. But you may be wondering, why is there all this emphasis on the collective unconscious in Genshin to begin with? And that's where we need to shift back from psychology to philosophy. In an attempt to explain how the world around him worked, the Greek philosopher Plato once proposed the idea known as the theory of forms. The concept itself is very simple, even though the language around it is kind of confusing. Basically, everything exists on two levels of reality, the physical and the intangible. The intangible level of existence consists of an idealized form, hence the name of the theory, a theory of forms. A form is basically the essence of an object or being. It's an idea or a concept which can be materialized onto the physical plane in some imperfect manner. This can be a little tricky to wrap your head around the first time you hear it, so let me give you an illustrated example of how this actually plays out in practice. This right here is a spoon. And so is this, and so is this, and this, and this, and this, and this is also a spoon, and so is this. Now, despite all of these spoons being of different materials, shapes, and sizes, and even purposes, we can all collectively agree that these are spoons. But objectively speaking, these are all very different objects. So why do we unanimously categorize them as the same thing? Plato says that this is because the concept of a spoon exists separately from a physical spoon. A physical spoon is merely an imperfect copy of what the idea of a spoon truly is, and this idea exists only within our mind or on a higher plane of existence, and it is therefore indestructible and eternal. Because these forms exist only within our minds, we can split the theory of forms into intangible thoughts and physical things, with the understanding that the things are just imperfect manifestations of thoughts. And since thoughts always precede things, you could make the claim that thoughts become things. I am oversimplifying the hell out of this dialogue, and that's okay. Now, it is implied in Nahida's second story quest and other places that elemental energy permeates the entire world. We're talking rocks, plants, water, air, basically all of nature has some level of elemental energy within it, with a few exceptions. This is why when she hears that Apep might die, or rather explode, she freaks out, claiming that the explosion of elemental energy would cause all the plants to go whoosh and just shoot up exponentially. The logical assumption we can make here is that elemental energy at some level makes up the fabric of Teyvat's physical reality. It makes up the physical things, at least in some proportion, so a huge influx of elemental energy would cause uncontrollable growth and creation. Irminsul works with memories and elemental energy, and these two things are somewhat interchangeable, or can at least be freely converted between each other. And if the world is even partially made up with elemental energy, and elemental energy can be converted to memories and memories are just thoughts, then Irminsul is simply allowing thoughts to become things. This should be theoretically how the streaming projectors in Bottleland work. They allow the preprints, which are like the blueprints or thoughts, to become physical things, and then the two can freely interact with each other. This is how Irminsul can rewrite books. This is how Wanderer erased himself from history. He didn't change time, he made the collective unconscious within Irminsul forget he existed, so those thoughts adjusted the things within Teyvat's reality. And this function becomes really obvious when you look back at how the Akasha works. For example, during the Sabzeruz Samsara festival, Nilu was the host of the collective unconscious. It was her dream that everyone was participating in. Her thoughts influenced the collective, and that was what shaped the reality of the dream space. Now, in Nahida's first story quest, Mosaeus was also kind of directing the dream world, but the people within it were shaping their own experiences. And you may remember how the depths of the chasm during the Perilous Trail quest responded to reflect the thoughts of each individual. Remember how the space itself was unstable? How time seemed to be relative to each individual person? Well, this was likely because within that chaotic space, as Yanfei dubbed it, not everyone there was in agreement about how reality should present itself, so each person was continuously shaping the world around them in very different ways and to very different extents. And if you think I'm crazy for all of this, or that this might just be a really huge stretch, I am obligated to tell you that this is not the first time HoYoverse has based a crucial element of their games on Plato's theory of forms. In fact, this exact same kind of thing can be found in both Gun Girl Z and Honkai Impact 3rd as the infamous Project Stigma, the final plan to defeat the ultimate form, which they called Finality. I am not going to go into detail on Project Stigma in this video, but I will leave a link to a great video that Homu Labs made on the subject if you want to learn more about it and its particulars. The only real relevant thing that you need to know about it that I have not mentioned yet is that Project Stigma was never completed in Honkai Impact, as the main characters found another solution. However, I do think it's quite plausible that Hoyo created Genshin to show what would have happened in a world where something like Project Stigma succeeded and humanity became the concept of humanity instead of physically a collective group of human beings. This idea would paint the Primordial One in an entirely different light. In the context of Plato's theory of forms manifesting itself into that as Irminsul, the role of the Primordial One might be akin to that of an all-encompassing god, a being with power and authority over literally everything. But the concept of everything can be split into multiple parts, and this is how we get 4 shades, 4 subcategories under the concept of everything. I've suggested in previous videos that the powers of the Primordial One and its shades are reflected in the 5 types of artifacts: life, death, time, space, and logos. In context, this makes total sense, as these are extremely high-level concepts that reality would have a very difficult time existing without. Humans are alive, so therefore we need the concept of life, but you can't really have life without death in the same way you can't have light without dark. And in order to measure life, one needs time, but time can only be measured by something's interaction with space. And all of these things require a sentient observer, Logos, in order to truly exist. Logos being the Primordial One after having split 4 pieces of itself makes sense, because without observation, the other concepts are pretty meaningless, right? And as time goes on, these conceptual gods would then split themselves into smaller and smaller pieces, resulting in lesser gods like Seelis, who would assume the titles of dust, salt, rock, vortex, and so on. Fast forward to modern times with the Archons, and we see that Archons not only govern an element on the physical realm, but also a concept on the intangible realm, like freedom, eternity, and wisdom. And all of these things are connected and projected via Irminsul, a synthetic conceptual world overlaid on top of the remains of the old world. All that said, I don't think that the Primordial One was really like a god in the traditional way that we think about them, that, you know, like created the world in 7 days and that kind of stuff. I think the truth is a little bit more sci-fi, and that would fit more thematically with Hoyo's history with Project Stigma. As previously mentioned, it is possible that Hoyo is treating Genshin as a look into what would have happened in Honkai Impact if Project Stigma had not been abandoned for an alternative solution. However, Genshin has no explicit mention of anything akin to the Honkai threat, which is the threat that actually prompted humanity to turn to Project Stigma in the first place. The closest thing we have to this is Forbidden Knowledge, which is likened to a poison by characters like King Deshret. You could make a case for Forbidden Knowledge to be similar to Honkai energy because some of the effects overlap, but it's a pretty weak argument overall. However, beings like dragons into that seem to have some level of resistance and even some compatibility with Forbidden Knowledge, as they are able to digest and utilize it in small quantities. This is something that humans cannot do, they just get Elazar. But their natural, albeit minimal, compatibility with forbidden knowledge makes sense because dragons were in Teyvat before humans were even a thing, and we know that forbidden knowledge existed all the way back then. So one therefore has to wonder, if forbidden knowledge made Teyvat hostile to humans, then why did the Primordial One try to rebuild Teyvat for humans? Why not just go somewhere else? And I think the answer to this is that humans are a native species to this planet. I think that at one point in time, Teyvat was actually Earth, and that a great disaster involving forbidden knowledge took place that wiped out most of the humans. The few who survived morphed and mutated into new forms, probably into dragons. And this isn't as big of a leap as you might think it is, because this is something that Honkai Energy can do in Honkai Impact. It can turn humans into Honkai beasts. That means that the Primordial One likely created Irminsul as a means to restart human civilization without having to worry about the corruption brought forth by the remnants of that forbidden knowledge disaster. It would allow humans to maintain their human form without mutating into monsters or dragons. But restarting human civilization means that there was a human civilization before all of this nonsense. And you know something? I think there were a few survivors from that civilization. Specifically, the twins. There are basically two things that we know about the twins. One is that they are indeed twins and therefore related by blood or construction, depending on your opinion. And the second is that one of them is a descender. Now, back in part 2 of this series, I argued that both twins were descenders and that both were native to Teyvat. You can watch that episode for a full argument, but I still think that the arguments I made there hold true, even though Nahida says that the sibling belongs to Teyvat while the Traveler does not. The thing is, forbidden knowledge is connected to the Abyss, and we know from Renee's notes that abyssal energy and all the stuff associated with it possesses a higher level of authority when compared to elemental energy. Now, whenever Hoyo refers to authority as it relates to Plato's theory of forms, it's referring to the scope of powers or control that someone has. Remember that forms are merely concepts that split into smaller, more specific concepts. One might start as having the authority over dust, but as their authority increases, they may gain control over sand, then stones, then all solids, right? The highest authorities here are the ones of the four shades: life, death, time, space, and eventually the Primordial One's logos. With this in mind, the siblings' actions start to make sense. The Abyss isn't an evil power, it's just power. And if the sibling wants to engulf the thrones of heaven, they will need access to more power and gain more authority. Abyssal energy has the ability to do that for them. So I think the siblings started off just like the Traveler, but upon realizing their innate incompatibility with abyssal power due to the fact that they're from a previous civilization that probably got wiped out by it, they realized they needed to change their physical form to adapt. This meant becoming a part of Teyvat's world, becoming a concept within Irminsul, and then seizing abyssal authority for themselves. And Khaenri'ah probably played a huge role in that. We don't seem to talk about this much for some reason, but we know that Khaenri'ah possessed the ability to peer beyond the veil of the sky, and on the other side, they found advanced technology that they studied to further their own technology. This reeks of Plato's allegory of the cave, wherein Khaenri'ans are the ones who looked outside of the cave and now wish to be free after seeing the true reality on the other side. For them to pin their hopes on the twins who are already free, who aren't bound by Irminsul and its laws, just makes sense. Especially if you remember back in episode 2 when I talked about the twins being akin to Lucifer, whose name means light bringer. Like the person who left the cave, got blinded by the light, and then came back in to bring the light to the rest of the prisoners. And I really think that's the whole point of the game. Khaenri'ah wants to be free at all costs, but the Primordial One has no intention of letting humanity free of its protective cradle, and everyone else is just caught in the middle. And we already know how this ends. We know that the twins are the last descendants of a subjugated civilization, that the Traveler is supposed to ascend to the throne of the Primordial One and take their place, and make that choice of freedom for the people of Teyvat. But the consequences of that choice? Well, let's just say I predict a lot of dragons in the future. Stick around for part 2 to find out why. Yeah, I know. Splitting a theory like this into 2 parts feels really bad, but trust me when I say it's definitely necessary, not just for my own editing comfort, but for the ease of explanation. It's just too confusing if it's all together. In part 2, and also the final part of this series, I swear it's for real this time, I will explore the alchemical side of things rather than the philosophical world building. We're going to talk about energy, memories, the magnum opus, and the truth about humanity's connection to the dragons. You will not want to miss this theory. It is the crackiest video in this entire series, and I've made some pretty bold claims so far, so that's a pretty big statement. Anyway, if you're still here, thank you so much for watching. And if you're a channel member, you've probably spotted your name scrolling past you on the screen right about now. I think that's a pretty cool thing, right? Knowing that you helped to make this. I mean, I think it's pretty cool. But yeah, so thank you once again. It is almost dragon time, so take care of yourselves. Make sure to get some water and some rest and some food, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Take care.